Hey everyone, today we're talking about one of the most anticipated horror movies in recent memory, Backrooms. This review will be mostly spoiler-free because I think a big part of this movie is simply experiencing it for yourself and deciding whether it works for you or not. If you've spent any amount of time on YouTube or around internet horror communities, you've probably heard of the Backrooms. The original concept exploded online because it tapped into a very strange and universal fear, the fear of being trapped in a place that feels familiar, but also completely wrong. The movie takes that basic idea and expands it into a full-length feature, and whether there is any possible way out. It's much more interested in creating a feeling of unease than it is in throwing jump scares at the audience every few minutes. It absolutely succeeds at creating that feeling. The backrooms themselves are incredibly eerie. Endless yellow hallways, old office spaces, ugly fluorescent lighting, outdated furniture, stained carpets, rooms that seem to go nowhere. Everything feels just a little bit off. It captures that uncanny feeling almost perfectly. The environments feel like places you've somehow been before, even though you know they don't actually exist. Unfortunately, that's also where my biggest problem with the movie begins. I honestly did not enjoy Backrooms nearly as much as I thought I was going to. Yes, each room has little differences. Maybe the furniture is arranged differently. Maybe the layout twists in a bizarre way. But for the most part, you're still looking at yellow office-like spaces with old carpeting and fluorescent lights that never quite look right. They're supposed to feel repetitive. They're supposed to feel endless. The problem is that while the characters are being worn down by the environment, the movie absolutely nails the liminal space aesthetic. I don't think anyone can argue against that. Some shots genuinely feel like they've been pulled directly out of your nightmares. The silence, the buzzing lights, the empty hallways, the impossible architecture. It's all incredibly unsettling. But atmosphere alone can only carry a movie so far. There were multiple points during the movie where I caught myself looking at my watch. Not because I was excited to see what happened next. That's never a good sign. And I don't think that's because the movie is difficult or complicated. I actually enjoy slow burn horror when it's done well. Movies like The Witch or Scarymovies ask for patience, but they constantly build tension underneath the surface. Backrooms, on the other hand, often feels like it's simply repeating itself without adding enough new ideas to justify the repetition. Honestly, I think the Backrooms concept works best in the format where it originally became popular. Short internet videos. A 5-minute YouTube clip showing someone wandering through an endless, impossible office building is fascinating. And unfortunately, I don't think this movie completely solves that problem. The original online videos worked because they left you wanting more. Here you're spending almost 2 hours inside the same general environment, and eventually the novelty starts to wear off. Now, I want to be fair because I genuinely appreciate what this movie is trying to do. Hollywood complains all the time that audiences want something new, and then when someone actually brings a fresh idea to the table, they deserve some credit. There really isn't much else out there quite like Backrooms. It isn't another haunted doll movie, another possession movie, or another generic slasher sequel. This is an original concept that grew out of internet culture and somehow became a major theatrical release. That's honestly pretty incredible, and I hope studios continue taking chances on projects like this. I want filmmakers to think outside the box. I want more experimental horror. I want more weird movies. But originality alone doesn't automatically make something good. For me, Backrooms feels like a fantastic idea that never quite evolves into a fantastic movie. There's been so much hype surrounding this project. Ever since it was announced, people have been talking about it like it was going to redefine modern horror. Maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe my expectations were simply too high. But when push came to shove, I felt like the movie failed to deliver on that promise. Ironically, I think the filmmakers may have realized this themselves. The movie spends so much time building atmosphere and wandering through these endless spaces that eventually it feels like it gets nervous about losing the audience. So instead of doubling down on psychological horror, It slowly starts drifting into something much more familiar. Without getting into spoilers, the film gradually begins to feel more like a slasher movie. You start getting chased. You start getting hunted. The focus shifts from the environment itself to surviving immediate physical danger. And honestly, I don't think that direction works very well. The backrooms are scary because of isolation, because of endless emptiness, because of the feeling that reality itself has broken. The horror comes from being trapped in a place that doesn't make sense, where every hallway looks almost identical and every turn feels wrong. Once the movie starts leaning too heavily into conventional horror mechanics, some of that unique identity gets lost. It almost feels like the movie stops trusting its own premise. Instead of allowing the audience to be consumed by existential dread, it starts throwing more direct threats into the story. And unfortunately, I don't think those threats are particularly effective. In fact, I found them to be some of the weakest parts of the entire film. The shift doesn't make the movie scarier. If anything, it makes it feel more generic. The strange, dreamlike atmosphere that made the first half so interesting slowly gives way to a much more standard horror formula. It's almost like watching two completely different movies stitched together. Then we get to what I think is the movie's biggest weakness, the storytelling. Backrooms raises a huge number of fascinating questions. Who built these places? What exactly are the backrooms? How do people end up there? Can they leave? Are they real physical locations or something else entirely? The movie also introduces some incredibly interesting ideas involving the scientists studying the phenomenon. You see hints of research, hints of experiments, hints that people may have been trying to understand or even control the backrooms for a very long time. And honestly, that part fascinated me more than almost anything else in the movie. I found myself wanting to know everything about these researchers. Who are they? How did they discover this place? What exactly are they doing? What are those strange machines? How long has this been going on? The problem is that the movie barely answers any of those questions. And I understand the argument that mystery is the entire point. Some people will say that explaining the backrooms would ruin them. I actually agree with that to a certain extent. You don't need to explain everything, but you do need to explain something. You need to give the audience enough solid information to build theories from. For me, the movie crosses the line where mystery stops being intriguing and starts feeling incomplete. A good mystery gives you pieces of the puzzle and lets you connect them yourself. Backrooms often feels like it simply refuses to hand you any of the pieces at all. You're left staring at an empty table, trying to imagine what the puzzle was even supposed to look like. The world itself never feels fully fleshed out. There are hints, there are suggestions, there are little glimpses of a much larger story happening behind the scenes. But almost none of it is explored in a meaningful way. By the end of the movie, I walked out with 100 questions and almost no answers. Normally, I actually like movies that leave things open to interpretation. Some of my favorite horror films don't explain everything. Part of what makes movies like that memorable is talking about them afterward and trying to figure out what really happened. The audience gets to participate, but there still needs to be a foundation to build those theories on. Take the psychologist storyline, for example. Without giving away major spoilers, there are moments that make you wonder whether what you're seeing is actually happening at all. Is she really a psychologist? Is she dealing with childhood trauma? Did she somehow create this entire reality inside her own mind? Or is the backrooms a real place that she has genuinely become trapped inside? Then you start asking even bigger questions. Are the other characters actually real? Do they exist outside of her perspective? Are they trapped there with her? Or are they simply fragments of her own imagination? Could the entire movie be taking place inside her head? Honestly, you have no way of knowing. And that's where the movie lost me. Leaving one or two major elements open to interpretation can be brilliant storytelling. Leaving almost everything open to interpretation starts to feel like the writers are avoiding giving concrete answers. At some point, ambiguity stops being clever and starts becoming frustrating. I kept waiting for that one scene that would finally anchor everything together, not explain every mystery, not solve every question. Just give me one solid piece of information that I could use to understand the world. That moment never came. Instead, the credits rolled, and I was left feeling like the movie had barely begun exploring its own ideas. Some people will absolutely love that. They're going to walk out and spend hours creating theories and discussing possibilities online, and that's perfectly valid. But personally, I think good world building requires at least some established rules. You need a framework. You need boundaries. Otherwise, literally any explanation becomes equally valid and the story loses its shape. In the end, I think Backrooms is a movie that succeeds much more as an atmosphere piece than as an actual narrative. It isn't particularly scary, at least it wasn't for me. It's eerie. It's uncomfortable. It's unsettling. But if you're a horror fan expecting to be terrified or sitting on the edge of your seat, I don't think this is that kind of movie. My overall experience was one of admiration mixed with disappointment. I admire the creativity. I admire the originality. I admire the fact that someone took a bizarre internet concept and turned it into a major film. But I also think the execution falls flat. The pacing is too slow, the repetition becomes monotonous, and the story asks far more questions than it ever attempts to answer. So would I recommend watching it? Actually, yes. I think it's worth seeing simply because there really isn't anything else quite like it. Just don't make the same mistake I did and go in expecting the next great horror masterpiece. Manage your expectations, accept that this is more of an eerie mood piece than a scary movie, and you might have a much better time than I did. As for whether you should pay theater prices to see it, my honest opinion is no. This feels like the perfect streaming movie. A rainy night at home, lights off, maybe watching it for free with friends and talking about all the weird theories afterward. That's where I think Backrooms works best. For me, it's an interesting experiment, a creative risk, and a movie I'm glad exists, but not one I'd ever feel the need to watch again.